Welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun Cho. President Donald Trump started his second administration with dozens of executive orders to redirect U.S. policy. Today we discuss how these shifts could affect U.S. allies in Northeast Asia. We also discuss President Trump's reference to North Korea as a nuclear power.
The Honorable Donald John Trump.
And we will not allow ourselves to be taken advantage of any longer. I will very simply put America first. But I was very friendly with him. He liked me, I liked him. They thought that was a tremendous threat. Now he is a nuclear power.
In the studio with me, Mr. Scott Snyder, the president and CEO of the Korea Economic Institute of America. Previously, Mr. Snyder was the director of U.S.-Korea policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. He also served as the director of U.S.-Korea Policy Center at the Asia Foundation. Mr. Snyder's latest book is the U.S.-South Korea Alliance, Why It May Fail and Why It Must Not. Also joining us, Mr. Christopher Johnstone, Managing Principal at the Asia Group and Senior Associate at the CSIS Japan Chair. Mr. Johnstone was the Director for East Asia at the National Security Council under President Biden. He also served as the Director for Japan and Oceanian Affairs at the NSC, Principal Director for South and Southeast Asia, as well as Director for Northeast Asia in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Now, Mr. Johnstone, Mr. Snyder, with President Trump returning to the White House, how will the overall approach and direction of the U.S. government change?
Well, as your opening said, President Trump really issued an avalanche of executive orders, I think more than we've ever seen, designed to reorient and redirect U.S. government policy. And it's a very comprehensive set of reviews that are reverberating around Washington. And I would say that there are three elements to that. One is there's a reformist element. Two, there's a disruptive element. And three, there's a retributive element. And so how the mix of those plays out, we'll have to see in the days to come.
Yeah, I think I would say the first point to make is that most of what Trump has focused on so far is domestically oriented, right? Where we've seen significant changes of direction around areas like immigration policy, climate change policy, energy policy, and other social issues. So we don't know the full picture on foreign policy yet. I think it's important to emphasize that there will be elements of continuity. There was continuity from Trump to Biden. There will be some elements of continuity from Biden to Trump. And one example of that was the Quad Foreign Ministers meeting on day one of the Trump administration, which was a very conscious and deliberate effort to emphasize that at least the Quad will remain a focus under this administration. But look, I think we also know that the Trump administration will bring a different frame to relationships overseas, a more transactional approach, a less sentimental approach about allies, increased scrutiny on things like defense spending. Tariffs are almost certainly part of this picture. So there will be a new dynamic in foreign policy. But I think it's also important, as I said, not to lose sight of the elements of continuity that have been there across Biden-Trump to date and will be there in this new phase as well.
And regarding foreign policy, Mr. Snyder, President Trump issued dozens of executive orders and declared a border emergency, energy emergency, withdrew from Paris Climate Agreement and WHO, and reversed Biden-era policies. How will the new executive orders affect the global security and trade order? And will the Trump administration completely reshape the international order?
Well, in many respects, I think that is the intent, is to reshape the international order. And if I were to describe what I think the administration and maybe President Trump himself aspires to do, it's actually to create what I would call a Trump-centric international order by asserting peace through strength. And so the really interesting question is, in fact, whether or not that effort will yield the end to some of the conflicts that we've seen and actually achieve some measure of stability in an era where it kind of feels like things have been spinning out of control globally. The proof will be in the pudding.
Spitting out of control, what will be some of the examples?
Well, just the fact that we had two simultaneous wars in the Middle East and, between Russia and Ukraine, the feeling that we have lost the ability to deter potential enemies, the looming confrontation between the U.S. and China. I mean, basically all over the world, it doesn't feel like there is a center. And I think that in some respects, President Trump himself wants to place his administration and himself at the center in a stable environment.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Johnstone, Presidents Xi and Putin held a video conference after the inauguration of President Trump. And during his first term, President Trump boasted his relations with Presidents Xi and Putin separate from U.S. pressure against China and Russia. There's criticism that during the Biden administration, both China and Russia became clear enemies of America. Do you think President Trump will try to change the dynamics, come up with tailored approaches to China and Russia, and possibly drive wedges between them?
Well, on the point about during the Biden administration, China and Russia becoming adversaries, I think much of that has to do with choices that were made in Moscow and Beijing. But look, I think President Trump will, to build on Scott's points, will certainly look for opportunities to deal with Putin and with Xi. He sees himself as a deal maker. He sees himself as a peacemaker. He sees foreign policy as originating from him, and that he brings strength and vision to this. But at the same time, I think it's really important to emphasize and to remember that he would not pursue a deal for a deal's sake, right? He will go about this process first by seeking to establish leverage and entering a dialogue with either Xi or Putin from a position of strength. And I think Putin is getting a taste of this. There's some indications that Moscow sees Trump's initial moves as not exactly what they expected. On the one hand, calling for dialogue, on the other hand, threatening sanctions and economic actions. You also see reporting that there was a dialogue between the outgoing Biden team and the incoming Trump team about how to sustain support for Ukraine, perhaps through European purchases of weapons from the United States on Ukraine's behalf. So this is going to be a much more complicated picture than Trump just simply seeking to get a deal. What the deal looks like matters, and entering that process from a position of strength will be, I think, a major priority for President Trump and his team. So one of the fundamental questions I have as we watch this process unfold is a deal possible, either with China or with Putin, given the fundamentally different perspectives on international order, on economic exchange, on principles of sovereignty and commerce. So I think that will also be a variable here that will shape what's possible.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Snyder, what changes will President Trump's America First policy bring to U.S.-Korea relations? President Trump, Secretary Rubio, Secretary nominee Pete Hegseth are all China hawks. Will the second Trump administration expect South Korea to be more proactive in joining with the United States in containing China?
Yes, I think so. But that's not necessarily anything new. I think that there's, as Chris has suggested, we should also look for continuities. And I think the Biden administration spent a lot of time focusing on China, and actually we saw allies paying more attention to coordinating with the United States on policies toward China. And so that, I think, is just a bigger piece of the picture as the alliances think about deterrence. The other factor, though, is I think that the Trump administration advisors have shown a deep desire possibly for reconfiguration of the alliance. And that may mean different roles and responsibilities. It may mean different contributions. On the one hand, I think there's an impulse to see Korea take a greater role in terms of securing its own defense. On the other hand, I think that there is a recognition that there is a lot that Korea can offer as a technology partner to strengthening a combined defense industrial base.
So you talk about how this is a continuation from the Biden era. So it will be very difficult if South Korea goes back to its past to balance between Washington and Beijing. That will be very difficult coordination of alliance relationship under the second Trump administration.
I think it's become more difficult, but the question that you're raising actually, I think, depends on whether or not South Korean political leadership thinks about the relationship between the U.S. and China from a domestic political perspective or from a threat perspective. And if it's from a threat perspective, and if, in fact, China does pose a growing threat, and it has progressed over the course of the past 4 years to become more important as a joint focus of the alliance, then it means that there are constraints, and it means that there is a necessity for Korea to maintain some sense of alignment with the United States.
Mr. Johnstone, the possibility of changing the role of U.S. forces Korea has been raised in the context of containing China. And Mr. Elbridge Colby, nominated as the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, stressed on this program on Washington Talk many times that the U.S. forces Korea should be focusing on deterring China. Is there a possibility that Korean forces will focus on defending themselves and U.S. forces Korea will shift their focus to containing China?
Yeah, from my point of view, there's almost no question that President Trump and his team will resume scrutiny on the U.S.-ROC alliance and the U.S. military presence in South Korea. As you know, this was a major focus of the first term. The Pentagon was looking at options for reductions in the U.S. presence on the Korean Peninsula, and it's quite possible that focus will continue, along with the pressure on South Korea and other allies, I should emphasize, to spend more money on defense. I think the key for South Korea and for really all allies is to come into this discussion with a clear frame on how the alliance benefits the United States in addition to how it benefits South Korea. That is the frame that the Trump administration will have, and I think that is the frame that allies must have when they enter these discussions. So the key for South Korea is to emphasize the benefits to the United States that flow from the alliance and flow from the military presence. And stepping back, right, China is the primary security challenge that the United States faces. That has been identified by 2 administrations now, and Trump will affirm that. So the question of how does the U.S.-ROC alliance facilitate, enable, strengthen U.S. competition with China has to be part of that discussion. And that's where we enter consideration of things like greater strategic flexibility for U.S. forces on the peninsula. So yes, I do think that this discussion is coming. And I do think, and we've had it in the past, the flexibility of the U.S. presence on the peninsula to be involved in other kinds of activities around the region. I do expect that discussion is coming.
Weren't you in the Office of the Secretary of Defense during the first Trump administration?
I was,
How
yes.
serious was the discussion about downsizing the Korean troops or refocusing, having that flexibility in Northeast Asia?
Quite significant consideration. There were development of real options for scaling back
So
the
what
U.S. presence.
stopped from that happening?
Most of it had to do with time. The administration, the clock ran out on the first Trump term. I think the other point to make here is that I think President Trump enters his second term when he looks at the Korean Peninsula, and fundamentally, I think his view is South Korea can defend itself, that it has the military capabilities to defend itself. And so the logic as we think about the alliance is what other benefits does the alliance provide to the United States, to South Korea, and how does it advance other U.S. strategic goals in the region? I think that's an important line of argument to think about.
Mr. Johnstone, is there any chance that President Trump will reconsider the extended deterrence commitment to South Korea? And recently, Japanese Foreign Minister Takeshi Iwaya visited Washington, and Japanese media say that he wanted to convey to the Trump administration the non-negotiables, which are the nuclear deterrence, the senkakus, and the response to North Korea. Given that U.S. and Japan were the best allies during the first Trump administration, what are the chances that President Trump will listen to Japan's demands to President Trump?
Yeah, I saw those comments. I mean, and my reaction was that, well, it's interesting that the Japanese side considers those to be non-negotiable. We'll see whether that's the case on the side of the Trump administration. Look, I don't know. I think it's too early to say whether on the specific question of extended deterrence, whether the Trump team would seek to sort of revisit that. Well, what I can say is there will be, and building on what I said before, there will be significant, I think, pressure on both Japan and South Korea to strengthen their own defenses, to contribute to extended deterrence with their own capabilities, in the first instance, conventional. This is, the ROC already has formidable long-range conventional capabilities. Japan is working on those. So there's a foundation to build upon. But there will be pressure to do more, and we'll see how far that goes. As for the relationship with Japan, Prime Minister Ishiba is likely to be one of the first leaders to visit Washington and see President Trump. It appears that he'll be in Washington in the first half of February, and we'll see how Trump approaches that relationship. It's certainly true that in the first term, the relationship between President Trump and Prime Minister Abe was strong. The Japanese are seeking to replicate that, and this will be the first opportunity to do so, and I think the first opportunity for the world to see how Trump chooses to engage a key ally.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Snyder, President Trump ordered to review U.S.'s trade policy and investigate trade imbalances and unfair trade practices. President Trump said the Korea-U.S. free trade agreement is a Hillary Clinton disaster, a deal that shouldn't have never been made. Do you think President Trump's return to power will lead to tougher trade demands on South Korea? How should South Korea respond?
Yes, I'm expecting tougher trade demands on South Korea. I have to note that one thing about the Chorus FTA is that President Trump talked about it completely differently once it was renegotiated under the first Trump administration. So I don't think South Korea should necessarily fear the opportunity to have a trade negotiation. There are some particular pressures that I think that the administration in South Korea will face. One is the merchandise trade imbalance, and so I expect that South Korean government will be under a lot of pressure to purchase oil and gas. Second, some aspects of tariffs are going to be unavoidable if there's a universal tariff, but others aspects may be an opening for negotiation, and some of them might actually be opportunities for South Korean firms. So for instance, punitive tariffs on China do open up opportunities for some South Korean firms in particular sectors.
Mm-hmm. Now I want to talk about North Korea. Mr. Snyder, on his first day in office, President Trump called North Korea a nuclear power, and so did nominee Pete Hegseth. And there's concerns that this could be an acknowledgement of North Korea as a nuclear power. Is there a possibility that President Trump may go for a small deal? How does his perception of North Korea being a nuclear power impact denuclearization efforts?
Well, I do think that President Trump is sending a signal that he wants to engage with North Korea, with Kim Jong-un directly. I think that, for the average public, North Korea is a nuclear power, but it's an illegal nuclear power. And so the question is whether President Trump actually drops the word illegal in implementation of policy. Some kind of small deal or arms control or any kind of step forward is inevitable whether or not you consider denuclearization to be the end goal. I personally think that denuclearization remains a necessary end goal because of the reasons that I cited earlier as related to the views of Congress and the American public about what is necessary to protect the United States from a potential North Korean threat.
President Trump said he would reach out to Kim Jong-un, and if President Trump does reach out to an illegal nuclear power, wouldn't that undermine the denuclearization NPT regime? And wouldn't that also encourage others to get their own nuclear weapons?
Yes, that's the reason why I think he's going to encounter a lot of domestic resistance. But there's another factor too, and that is that I think that Kim Jong-un still has a bad taste in his mouth from Hanoi. And internally, they have not yet reset their policy, and I think will not during this calendar year, not until they get to their 9th Party Congress.
You're talking about the 5-year armed development of North Korea plan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Johnstone, President Trump called Kim Jong-un a smart guy, and he said, unlike Iranian leaders, Kim Jong-un is not a religious zealot. Why do you think President Trump speaks highly of Kim Jong-un and emphasizes his personal relationship with Kim Jong-un? The first Trump administration aides say that we shouldn't take President Trump's words at face value. Do you think President Trump's comments should be taken as a negotiation strategy?
I definitely think it's part of a negotiating strategy. No question about this. And just to build on Scott's really excellent and interesting points. I mean, as I've said before, Trump sees himself as a deal maker. I think he believes that his personal relationship with Kim Jong-un could help advance the cause of a deal. I think it's possible that Trump would view the U.S. military presence on the peninsula as a potential element of pursuing a deal. But again, it's important to emphasize Trump will not be interested in just any deal. As Scott noted, the memories of Hanoi are on both sides, right? Where President Trump also judged that he wasn't getting enough from Kim Jong-un to move forward. So I think the other question for me and I'd be interested in Scott's views on this, it seems to me that the strategic context for North Korea has changed in a pretty fundamental way since those talks back in 2018, 2019. Right, North Korea has developed a strong relationship with Russia, continues to have its own ties with China. Seems to me that Kim Jong-un has a lot more options than he did then. Mm-hmm. So what is his incentive for a serious and meaningful negotiation with the United States? I think that remains to be seen.
Mr. Snyder, President Trump said, I think Kim Jong-un has tremendous condo capabilities. He's got a lot of shoreline. Why do you think President Trump keeps on talking about building condo in North Korean coast? And North Korean defector elites say that building condos with American manpower and capital would only have Kim Jong-un lose his grip on the power. Do you think that incentives of opening and capitalism can really be a gift to Kim Jong-un?
No. I think that Kim Jong-un recognizes that a full embrace of economic reform and capitalism and openness means the end of the regime. And so I think it's a non-starter, actually, but it shows that President Trump still has that dream of real estate development in North Korea, and that he thinks that would be potentially attractive to Kim.
Mr. Snyder, President Trump's mentioning of North Korea as a nuclear power, some say, amplifies South Korea's security concern. Soon after President Trump called North Korea nuclear power, prominent politicians from Korea, from the ruling party, immediately stressed that South Korea should go nuclear. Even with such backlash, do you think President Trump would see nuclear armament by Korea or Japan as an effective way to contain China at low cost?
That's just one of the many elements, I think, of the U.S.-China competition. And so I don't think that we can necessarily rule it in or rule it out, because there are so many factors involved in the way in which the United States is girding for competition with China. It is one instrument, but it is one instrument among many, and so I would not necessarily exclusively focus on the answer to that question as the key to the China problem.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Mr. Johnstone, Mr. Snyder, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. We'll be back here next week with U.S. experts to discuss the two Koreas and the region right here from Washington.